the picture.
Well, hey, good morning. How are you all on this beautiful, picturesque Sunday morning? I don't know about you, but nothing says that it's almost baseball season like waking up and seeing a number that's less than 20 on a thermometer. But hey, speaking of baseball, before we get into the message today, there's something on my heart that I feel like I need to be transparent with you guys about. There's something that I feel like I need to come clean, that if you are going to sit there and listen to me this morning, I feel like you deserve to know something about me. And that is that I am a St. Louis Cardinals fan. Yeah, I know. And listen, before you walk out, just like, listen, you don't ever have to listen to me again. We don't have to be friends. Just hear me out, because that's not my entire story. I was born in St. Louis. I was raised in a house that we rooted for St. Louis teams. And yeah, I've got a little bit of the pretentiousness, the stereotypical pretentiousness of like, we've got 11 world championships. No one can talk to me, right? Like, and that's super fun. But here's the other side of that, is that I'm not only a St. Louis Cardinals fan, but I'm also a diehard, lifelong St. Louis Blues fan. And I know one homie over here is wearing a St. Louis Blues jersey. I don't know your name, but I saw you earlier, and it made my heart full. There are dozens of us, guys. Hockey fans, unite. All right, so if you don't know, the Blues are a hockey team. If you don't know, hockey is a game that's played with teams of athletes on a sheet of ice, and they use like these wooden sticks to try to get this piece of rubber into a goal. And like very few of you guys have any interest in hockey, but I grew up a diehard hockey fan, a diehard St. Louis Blues fan. And if you want to know what it's like to be a Blues fan, just imagine that you are Charlie Brown, trying to kick a football that Lucy's holding for you, and every single time you go to kick it, she just pulls it out from underneath you, and that just keeps happening over and over again for more than 50 years. That's what it's like to be a St. Louis Blues fan. They were a team that was established in the year 1967, and for the first 3 years in their existence, they made it all the way to the Stanley Cup final. It's the last round of the playoffs. You win that round, you win the championship. They made it the first 3 seasons in existence, and then never made it to that round again until 2019. Now, I got married in 2014, and one of the things that my wife had to quickly learn about was that I had a very, borderline unhealthy relationship with the St. Louis Blues with hockey. I don't think she realized that being married to me meant that for 82 regular season games, hockey would be on in our living room, that I would be emotionally just like so enthralled in what was going on that I couldn't really engage with anything else. And inevitably what would happen, because the Blues are a team that would always tease the fans, right? I would talk myself every year into believing this is it. This is our year. And inevitably, every single season would end in complete heartbreak. And my wife would see me, and she would see what this does to me, and she would ask, why? Why do you do this to yourself? If it causes you that much pain, like I know you enjoy it, but why do you allow yourself to get so hurt by this team? And I said, Bailey, you don't understand. One day, the season won't end in heartbreak. One day, we will win a Stanley Cup. And when we do, all of those heartbreaks are going to make that moment even sweeter. And on June 12th, 2019, 6 days after my daughter Gwendolyn was born, so I have to say it wasn't the greatest day of my life, but it was maybe a close second or third, the St. Louis Blues finally won a Stanley Cup. And I was right. All of those heartbreaks, man, it was like my entire life of almost 30 years of just like being dedicated to this team, heartbreak after heartbreak, made that championship so much sweeter. And you guys all know what I'm talking about as Royals fans, as Chiefs fans. Like, you've experienced the same thing, right? Where when your teams reach the mountaintop, it's so much sweeter because of all of the obstacles that you hit on the way. And we love that in all of our stories. We are drawn to real life stories where someone has to overcome obstacles. They have to overcome pain and suffering. Heck, in books, in movies, in TV shows, if we don't have enough tension, if there isn't enough pain and suffering for our heroes to overcome, we don't think it's a very compelling story. And yet, when it comes to real life, when it comes to our own lives, we don't find it quite as charming when we have to go through the character development part of the hero's journey. Right? When things happen to us, when we are the ones that are on the receiving end of the hardship, when we are being built up by pain, by sorrow, by suffering, we don't seem to appreciate that part of our story quite as much. We're in the book of John, and in this portion of John that we've come to, we're gearing up for the home stretch. And in this portion of Scripture that we've been in for the last several weeks, Jesus is addressing his disciples for the final time before he's going to be sold over to his eventual execution. And in this farewell address of sorts, what we've seen is that Jesus paints several pictures of himself to his disciples. So far in this series, we've seen a picture of Jesus as a gardener who prunes us, a painful yet necessary process for us to be able to bear fruit. We've seen a picture of Jesus as a friend. We've seen Jesus as a scout who warns us what's coming. And last week, Brandon Kelly did an amazing job of showing us that Jesus paints a picture of himself as a sender. This week, we're going to see a complex yet powerful picture of Jesus as the giver of joy. Now, when we talk about joy, a lot of us confuse joy with happiness. They're not exactly the same thing. They're similar. They feel very similar, but they're not the same. The biggest difference is that happiness is almost always dictated by our circumstances. That happiness, in order for us to feel happy, we can't also feel sad. It is very, very difficult to feel both happy and sad. And so when our circumstances are good, right, we're happy. When our circumstances are not good, we are unhappy. And often what most of us do is we chase down happiness. And we do that by trying to chase the circumstances that we want. And unfortunately, because happiness is so dictated by our circumstances and our circumstances are so fickle, so many of us find ourselves just constantly chasing this elusive idea of happiness. Or maybe you've got it, but you can't hold on to it for very long. Maybe some of you guys are here this morning and you put on a happy face, but underneath that, there's a lot of pain. That you're going through a season of sorrow that people don't even realize that you're experiencing. Or maybe you're here and in life, you're waiting for a break. You feel like Charlie Brown trying to kick the football. You feel like, man, the rug just keeps getting pulled out from underneath me. When am I going to catch a break? And for others of you, maybe even recently, you've experienced some sort of profound tragedy in your life. And what happens is when we experience tragedy, we start to consider, what is God doing in the world? Like, what is he doing in my life? Why would a God who says he loves me and is good allow tragedies to happen? And yet, in all of this, Jesus paints a picture of himself as a giver of joy. So let's unpack this enigma of joy. Let's jump in. We're in John chapter 16. We're going to be in verses 16 through 24 today. Let's dive in. Jesus says, "A little while, and you will see me no longer. And again, a little while, and you will see me." What's he saying? He's talking to his disciples. We know, because we have the benefit of hindsight, we know the full story of Jesus. The disciples didn't. We know what Jesus is talking about. The disciples have no idea what he means. We know that he's saying, hey, I'm about to be killed. I'm going to be dead for 3 days, and then I'm going to raise from the dead. They don't realize that that's what he's saying, but here's what he says. So some of the disciples, right, they said to one another, they're confused. What is this that he says to us? A little while, and you will not see me. And again, a little while, and you will see me. And because I am going to the Father. So they were saying, what does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. In verse 19, Jesus knew that they wanted to ask him. So he said to them, is this what you're asking yourselves, what I meant by saying a little while, and you will not see me, and again a little while, and you will see me? So let's talk about this little 3-word phrase, a little while. It doesn't seem like a very significant phrase, and yet in this context, it is massive. Because the idea of a little while is where the tension comes into the story. The biggest source of tension in the phrase a little while is that it's so vague. There's nothing specific about a little while. And I know some of you guys can relate to this idea of waiting a little while for God to show up in your life, for something that you're praying for to finally come to pass. And you don't know how long that little while is going to be. And every day that you wake up and you don't feel like God has answered that prayer yet, your faith is tested. This also makes me think of several stories throughout the Bible where God makes a promise to somebody and then it takes years for it to become fulfilled. I think about the story of Abraham. Abraham, at the age of 75, is old and childless, and God shows up and he says, hey, Abraham, not only are you going to have a kid, but you're going to father an entire nation. And he's like, cool, that sounds awesome. And then 25 years pass. And Abraham is around 100 years old when he finally has his first son. I think about Joseph later in the book of Genesis, who has a dream at the beginning of his story that doesn't fulfill until 20 years later. I think of Moses when he went off to be with God when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and he went to go be with God for 40 days and 40 nights. And what he was coming back with was so incredible. And yet the Israelites grew impatient because Moses was gone for so long. Their faith was tested, and they turned to idolatry in the famous story of building the golden calf. Even in this book of John that we've been studying, I think of the story of Lazarus. That little while was so long that Lazarus died. They said, hey, Jesus, your friend Lazarus is sick. And they waited, and Lazarus died. Now, we know the end of that story. We know that Jesus showed up, that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. We know, with the benefit of hindsight, looking at these stories from the outside, we know that God is doing something amazing. Yet I wonder how many times we really identify with the people who are waiting a little while for God to fulfill his promises. Just imagine how torturous. It's been 12 years since God told Abraham, hey, you're going to have a kid. And he's like, dude, are you sure? He's like, yeah, I am. And so when Jesus is talking to his disciples, this idea of a little while, I think we get a little bit more insight into this idea. And here's what Jesus says specifically to his disciples, what their little while is going to look when we look at the first part of verse 20. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. Ouch. That doesn't sound fun at all. I want you to think of one of the hardest things that you've experienced in your life. I want you to think of the worst tragedy that you've ever experienced. And it's hard enough to navigate tragedy with the benefit of friends and family who are there to encourage and support us as we walk through it. What's going to happen with Jesus' disciples is not only is their world going to be turned upside down when Jesus is murdered, when he is publicly executed, but they're going to be vastly outnumbered by the voices who are raucously celebrating the death of Jesus. With this insight, we can understand why somebody like Peter went from being just this sold-out follower of Jesus to all of a sudden denying Jesus 3 times. The devastation of, oh my gosh, this unforeseen tragedy happened, and not only that, but the people around me are happy about it. I can't imagine a lower place to be. And yet, here's how Jesus finishes that thought in the second half of verse 20. He says, but your sorrow will turn into joy. That's a really interesting phrase to me. He doesn't say that your sorrow will be replaced with joy. He doesn't say that your sorrow will go away. He says your sorrow will turn into joy, which kind of suggests that in order to get to joy, you actually have to go through the period of sorrow. Now, that's hard for me to wrap my mind around. So as I'm considering this, I thought, is that really how God designed the world, that we have to go experience something bad so that we can have joy? And where I landed on is that no, that's not how God designed us. That's not how God designed the world. We see this because the first story in the Bible, after God has created the entire universe and after he's created humanity, is that there is no sorrow. In the Garden of Eden story with Adam and Eve, before they sinned, heaven and earth were one. That God communed with Adam and Eve, that there was no pain, there was no suffering, there was no sorrow, there was no necessary character-building portion of the story in order for Adam and Eve to experience joy until what happened? Until they sinned. And I think sometimes we get this idea that sin is just this thing that we made God mad, so now he's got to punish us. And that's not it. Sin literally, as a natural consequence, it separated Adam and Eve from God. It tainted their very existence. It brought on these natural consequences that God had never intended. And God explains this at the end of this story, that as a result of them choosing to sin, of sin entering into the world, death is now entered into the human experience. That life is going to be really hard, that the process for women of bringing life into the world is going to be extremely painful. Not because God is angry and he's exacting his wrath, but because these are the natural consequences of sin that destroys and breaks our world. But here's the good news. Even then, God already had a plan for redemption. What are we talking about when we talk about redemption? It doesn't mean, hey, I'm going to get even. I think sometimes we think, I'm going to redeem myself. I'm going to get even. That's not what it means. Redeeming something means to set it right, to make it the way that it once was. To redeem a debt, legally speaking, just means to repay that debt, to reset the board. And God always had this plan. That in spite of the consequences of sin, in spite of the consequences for death and brokenness and suffering that come into the world as a result of sin, that in spite of all of that, God is going to redeem all of it. And I think that we get this idea that God is that he's passive. That he sits back in heaven and he watches our lives and he's like, I see this cancer diagnosis coming, or I see this tragedy happening or whatever, and I'm just going to, hands off. I don't really care. I don't think God's passive at all. I think so often we miss the fact that God is actively redeeming our situations no matter what our circumstances look like. And that as a result of our own sin, as a result of our own brokenness, that might necessarily require us to go through periods of suffering. And it's really hard for a lot of us to grasp. I would venture to say that most of us have seen this as an obstacle to joy, as opposed to part of our path towards finding the joy that Jesus is talking about. And I think the reason that we feel that way is because I think too often we confuse true joy with counterfeit joy. When Jesus says that your sorrow will turn into joy, I think that we misinterpret what joy is supposed to look like. We fall for the counterfeit that is solely based on our circumstances. We say, if God's going to turn my sorrow to joy, that must mean that my life is going to get easier and more comfortable. But that's not how it works. But this is what we think. We think, well, once I get this promotion at work, then I'll be filled with joy. Once I have this many friends, I'll have joy. Once I get married and finally start a family, I will have joy. Or if my family member or my friend who's sick and in the hospital overcomes their sickness, then I will have joy. Or if God answers this specific thing that I'm praying for and gives me exactly what I want, then I'll have joy. But Jesus doesn't say that your comfort will turn into joy. He doesn't say that your success will turn into joy. He doesn't say that your achievements will turn into joy. What does he say? He says your sorrow will turn into joy. He elaborates with this example in verse 21. He says, when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for the joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also, you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice. And, dude, this is big. No one will take your joy from you. it's interesting that one of the consequences for sin that's specifically mentioned in the Garden of Eden is women having pain at childbirth as they bring life into the world. And now Jesus uses that as an example for how he wants to redeem our sorrow into joy. Raise your hand if you have ever been in the room for the delivery of a child. Yep. All right, so here's the thing. This is going to get real personal, all right? Like, I hope we're all right. We don't have to talk about your experiences, but I'm going to talk about my experiences, all right? Sound good? So, I have been in the room for all 3 of my children's births, and I have to say, I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, but it's the coolest thing that I've ever been a part of. Like, I've talked to other dads who said, like, I've never been able to look at my wife the same since I saw her give birth to my children. Like, I had a completely different experience. To me, it was the coolest thing. In fact, when we had our 3rd child, Jane, our nurse actually took a video of the birth, and I actually brought that video with me. I'm going to put it up on the screen because I want to share. I'm just kidding. My wife is so mad that I even made that joke. She's like, that's not even funny. She's like, people are going to know I gave birth. They know what that means. I don't like it. I do have that video, though. I don't know if that makes me weird, but, like, I love it. It's this incredible thing. Now, part of the reason that it's such an incredible experience is because I don't actually have to experience any of the pain, right? Like, my job is pretty easy. And with Jane, it was actually a very easy delivery, but I remember our first kid, Elijah, who's actually sitting in here this morning. Hey, buddy, how are you? He'll be 7 this year, which is insane. But I remember when he was born, and it was our first time experiencing everything that comes with pregnancy and childbirth. And there's this anxiety of, like, is this normal or is it not normal? And it's this weird, like, anxiety, but you're also excited. And I remember her water broke at like 4 a.m. And we go into the hospital and we're there. And I learned what dilation was. And I wish that I hadn't. But we're there for like several hours. And then finally the doctors are explaining, like, hey, this is the process. This is what we're waiting on. And then when we get to this point, then she can start to push. And finally, they say, all right, it's time to start pushing. This baby's coming. I get so excited. Like, you know when you get excited and you, like, almost can't even feel your legs? Like, you feel like you're walking on clouds. Like, oh, my gosh, my world is about to be forever changed. And so I assumed my position, which was holding my wife's foot up on the stirrup because it kept falling off, which was very funny. My job was to hold her foot up and talk to her like a Little League coach. Come on, Bailey, you can do it. I'm just going to say I killed it, man. I did my job. There were a lot of people doing a lot of things, but I definitely handled my part, for sure. But I settle into my position, and I'm thinking, all right, man, any minute, I'm going to be a dad. And then we stayed in those positions for almost 3 hours. That's a long time. If you haven't had a kid, if you haven't been in the room for a delivery, like, it was so long that really they should have said, all right, we can't do this naturally. We got to do a C-section. And I remember the feeling that I had of not really being able to offer anything other than, like, words of encouragement and making sure that her numb foot didn't fall off the stirrup. But I just remember this feeling of helplessness of, like, watching my wife in this anguish, knowing that something so amazing is happening, but just this, like, why does it have to be this difficult? It was scary. And then right before they decided, all right, cool, we gotta go into C-section. We got to do this. We got to change up our strategy here. He decides to make an appearance. And he comes out. And I will never forget the look on my wife's face and the way that it changed when she held our son for the first time. That I watched a lot of facial expressions over those 3 hours. A lot of tears. And it was something completely different instantly. That as hard as that sorrow was, it was all for this purpose of this amazing joy-giving, like, mind-blowing experience. And in that moment, all of that sorrow, all of that anguish, it went away. Now, it's easy for me to say, right? Because I wasn't the one that was in her position experiencing that. But I can tell you from being there and just being with my wife and seeing the way that she changed, it's incredible what happens. And it's so interesting that Jesus uses the example of childbirth in this idea of him redeeming our sorrow and turning it into joy. There's this thought that I had this week of having pain that is almost pre-redeemed. What do I mean by that? So there was a part of us that even though we were scared, even though it was extremely difficult, we still knew that ultimately the entire experience was an incredible experience. Like, we knew that. And the 2 times after that we had children, like, we knew, hey, this is going to be really hard for a time, but it's also like part of the greatest thing that we'll ever get to be a part of. It's almost like there was redemption for that pain before the pain even occurred. And I wonder what would happen if we would start to view our lives that same way. That when we experience tragedy, when we experience sorrow, instead of saying, hey, God, where are you? What if instead we started to see it the way that he describes it, as pre-redeemed? That from the moment that pain and suffering entered the world, God already had a plan to redeem it. That redemption, for whatever it is that life has thrown at you, has already happened. It just maybe hasn't happened yet. Does that make sense? Like, God is already actively redeeming it, but just like Abraham and Joseph and Moses and Lazarus, like, it might take a little while. And so there's going to be times where on your journey towards this unspeakable joy that God says no one can take away from you, that before you're all the way there, you're going to have to experience some really dark times. Not because that's what God wants for you, but because that's the reality of the world that we live in. And that in order to fully redeem such a messed up situation, you might have to go through some really, really severe lows. But that on the other side of that is true joy. Not this counterfeit joy that can be taken away from you. True joy that God says no one can take away from you. And if I'm being honest, I think that might be really challenging for some of us in this room. This idea that, like, okay, cool, God wants to give me this amazing joy, and so that means that I have to suffer? Like, that's really hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I think a lot of it is just because we are so conditioned to chase after happiness, a conditional happiness that we confuse as the joy that God has for us, the profound divine joy that God has for us. I think it's specifically challenging for those of us in the Western church. I think that if you grew up in church in this part of the world, then there was either directly or indirectly this idea of the prosperity gospel that was communicated to you. This idea that if you follow Jesus, your life will be better. That maybe it'll get easier. God will make this thing happen for you if you follow him. And not only, guys, is that not true, it's not biblical. Like, that's just not, read the story. Like, read what happened to the very disciples that Jesus is talking about. Their lives did not get easier. And yet they received a joy that no one could take away from them. How can that be? It's almost like joy isn't dependent on our circumstances. I think of years ago, this is actually how me and my wife kind of met. We were on a trip in China, teaching English. You're not allowed to be a missionary in China. It's illegal. So we were there with a group of English teachers who were sort of leading an underground ministry. Now, here's how it works in China. You are allowed to be a Christian. There's nothing illegal about being a Christian. However, you can only gather at a state-sponsored service. There has to be a government official that's monitoring the service. You can have a Bible, but it has to be a state-approved Bible that conveniently has parts of Scripture taken out. And so the reality is, for Chinese individuals who choose to follow Jesus, the way that it typically looks is very dangerous. It's illegal. They meet in underground house churches that are very much not okay with the government. And it's like this in a lot of places in the world. It's hard for us in America to wrap our minds around, but you cannot tell somebody in that environment, hey, if you follow Jesus, your life will get easier. No, actually, the opposite is true. But what I can tell you is it's hard to explain the difference in the joy that I felt around the Christians in China that I met. Their lives were undeniably harder because they were following Jesus, and yet their joy made me jealous. Because their joy wasn't based on their circumstances, it was based on their Redeemer. Jesus finishes this thought in verses 23 and 24. He says, "In that day you will ask nothing of me. Truly, truly, I say to you, whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give to you. Until now, you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full." Again, he says this to people who are going to be martyred for their faith. Which means that we can't tie joy to circumstance. And that means the inverse is true also, that when we go through really rough circumstances, that does not separate us from this idea of joy that God wants to give to us. This idea here, this is what full redemption looks like. This was the plan that God had all the way at the Garden of Eden. That his heart was wrenched by the introduction of sin into our world, by the separation of God and man. And that all the way back then, his plan was to send Jesus to rebuild that bridge between God and man. This is what full redemption looks like. And what is the result? We are full of joy. See, Jesus is the only true giver of joy. The only one. In order for us to receive the joy that God has always intended for us, redemptive work has to take place. And where it gets hard is that it's not always instant. And it's not always comfortable. And it doesn't always give us the impact in our life that we hope that it did. Right? There's not a lot of times that people say, "Hey, God, I'm going through this really hard tragedy. Will you just bless my life and make me a blessing to other people through it?" No, very often we say, "Hey, God, can you fix this thing?" Because while we want to play checkers, God is playing chess. And he's doing something that is so much bigger than just fixing our circumstances or making our lives easier. And thank God. Because if that's what he was doing, what we receive isn't true joy, it's counterfeit. And that's the kind of fake joy or happiness that when it's depending on our circumstances, anybody can just snatch that away from you. And so, man, if you were here this morning and life's just beating you up, you're feeling so discouraged, I want to encourage you that God isn't present once that thing is fixed. That God isn't your Redeemer once that situation is fully redeemed. That God isn't sitting back waiting for you to get stronger and earn his affection before he steps in and puts a blessing on your life. He's already done it. And that might not mean that you avoid tragedy in your life. It might not mean that life is easy for you. In fact, historically speaking, following Jesus is not an easy thing. It does not improve the quality of your life. We are very fortunate to be Christians in the part of the world that we are, in the time that we're alive. But the danger is that we miss the real thing. We miss the real joy that God has for us. And so this morning, as we wrap up and we get ready to take communion, I want to ask you this question, which is, where are you looking for joy? I think every single person in here is looking for it. And you might be chasing a counterfeit version, thinking it's the real thing, but I think every single one of us is pursuing joy. And I would venture to say most of us are frustrated. But the question that I want to ask is, where are you looking for it? Are you looking for it in your circumstance? Are you looking for it in the absence of tragedy? Or are you looking for it in Jesus? Because Because Jesus doesn't promise us that our lives will be easy. He doesn't promise us that we will avoid sorrow, but he does promise us that when we follow him, when we trust him, and we allow that time to pass, that he will turn that sorrow into joy. And that joy, nobody can take away from you. No tragedy can take it away from you. No circumstance can take it away from you. No persecution can take it away from you. And I just wonder how often in my own life that I've missed that. And how different my life would be if I really understood what true joy was. And I really understood where to find it. And so every week we end with communion. And at communion, we are remembering what God did on the cross. We are remembering the literal redemption on the cross. And so maybe for you, this is just a perfect moment. I say this every time. When we're doing communion, we do it together. But man, for that moment, it's just you and God. You don't have to worry about anybody else. You don't have to talk about it to the person next to you. Just you and God, and just be real. Are you looking for joy in Jesus, or are you looking for it in your circumstances? Are you discouraged? Are you hurting? Are you full of sorrow? Talk to God about it. Reflect on the redemptive work of Jesus. And just maybe trust him with your sorrow. Let's take communion.